The world did not break when he arrived. That was the first lie. No alarm screamed across the planet. No ancient prophecy stirred. No cosmic force announced itself with fire or thunder. Reality did not reject him. It adjusted, quietly, almost politely, as if the universe itself hesitated, unsure whether it was allowed to say no. A man fell from the sky and did not die. He landed not in a battlefield, not in a city prepared for gods, but in the middle of a world already choking on its own heroes. A world where power was regulated, categorized, argued over in committees, weaponized in secret, and sold back to the public as safety. A world that believed it understood strength because it had survived it. This man wore no symbol anyone here recognized. His breath was steady, his heartbeat calm, and yet the ground beneath him cracked in patterns that made no sense, not from impact but from restraint, as if something immense had chosen, deliberately, not to push back. Somewhere far away, instruments designed to detect the impossible went silent, not overloaded, not destroyed, simply uncertain. The contradiction wasn't that an alien god had arrived. The contradiction was that he didn't feel like a threat. He stood, looked around, and felt something he had never felt before. Limits. Not his own, but the world. In this universe, power always came with consequence. Magic had rules. Science had ceilings. Even monsters paid a price for existing. But as he took his first step forward, nothing pushed back. No resistance. No cost. The laws that governed this reality bent subtly around him, the way water bends around something too dense to displace. Across the planet, minds sharpened with instinctive unease. Leaders felt it without knowing why. Heroes paused mid-motion, struck by a sudden, irrational doubt. Somewhere deep beneath layers of glass and steel, men who believed they controlled the future felt something cold settle behind their thoughts. This world had been built on the idea that power must be managed. And now something had arrived that did not ask permission to exist. Not to conquer, not to save, but simply to be. And the most dangerous question began to spread, unspoken but unavoidable. What happens to a universe obsessed with control when something arrives that cannot be controlled at all? If you choose to stay, understand what that means. This is not a story that moves quickly or kindly. It does not rush toward comfort, and it does not promise that the strongest voice will be the right one. What unfolds here lives in the spaces between decisions, between silence and action, between restraint and consequence. This world will not be saved by spectacle. It will be tested by presence, by hesitation, by the quiet pressure of something that refuses to fit into the roles it is given. If you remain, you are agreeing to watch power lose its certainty, to see heroes question the rules that made them heroes, to sit with discomfort when answers refuse to arrive on time. Some moments will feel slow. That is intentional. Slowness is where consequences form. Do not listen for explosions. Listen for the pause before one should have happened. This story asks only one thing of you: attention, not loyalty, not belief, just the willingness to stay long enough to feel when something fundamental shifts. Because once you witness a universe realizing its limits were optional, it becomes impossible to forget. And forgetting, in a world like this, is the most dangerous thing of all. The sky did not tear open when he fell. That was the detail that unsettled the instruments first. No rupture in atmosphere, no surge in exotic radiation, no flare bright enough to justify panic, just a sudden recalibration in the numbers, like a scale forced to accept a weight it had never been designed to measure. He landed on asphalt that had already cracked 100 times before, in a city that had seen worse than miracles and survived by pretending it understood them. Traffic slowed not because of shockwaves, but because drivers sensed something ahead that didn't belong in the flow. Tires screeched late. Horns stuttered, then fell silent. A man in a suit dropped his phone without realizing it, eyes fixed on the figure standing where no one should have been. He straightened slowly, brushing dust from his shoulders. No symbol marked him. No aura announced him. His cape, red, faded at the edges, settled behind him like it always had, heavy with a familiarity this world did not share. He took a breath and felt it immediately. Resistance. Not from gravity, not from air. From structure. This place had rules stacked on top of rules, invisible lines deciding who could move, who could act, who was allowed to matter. He could feel them pressing in, not against his body, but against the idea of him. It was subtle, defensive, like a system bracing itself without knowing what for. "Okay," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "That's new." Several blocks away, deep beneath glass and reinforced steel, a monitor flickered. At first no one reacted. Glitches happened. Sensors disagreed all the time. The universe was noisy. But then another display flattened. Then another. Predictive curves collapsed inward, not spiking, not diverging, simply refusing to extrapolate. A technician leaned forward, pulse quickening. "Sir, the model just stopped." "What do you mean stopped?" his supervisor asked, already moving closer. "It's not projecting outcomes," the technician said. "It's waiting." The supervisor frowned. Systems did not wait. Above ground, he began to walk. Not toward towers or landmarks. Not toward the skyline where heroes usually made their entrances. He moved through side streets where the city breathed in smaller, more honest ways. Past a coffee shop where a barista forgot an order mid-sentence. Past a bus stop where people checked their phones too often, as if reassurance might arrive through a screen. He felt eyes on him, some curious, some afraid, most uncertain. In this world, uncertainty was dangerous. A woman stepped back instinctively as he passed, heart racing without explanation. A street preacher faltered in the middle of a sermon, losing his place as if the words had slipped out of order. Somewhere overhead, a camera tried to focus and failed, the image blurring not from motion, but indecision. High above the city, Superman hovered motionless. The pause had reached him like a held breath snapping too late. His senses, tuned to imbalance, had all reacted at once, and then found nothing to anchor to. No threat, no disaster, just a hollow where something should have registered. He closed his eyes, listening harder. Heartbeats returned, traffic noise, wind against steel, everything was there. Except the thing that mattered. "That's not possible," he murmured. In the watchtower, Batman felt it too, not as absence but as insult. His systems were built on the assumption that everything left a trace. Even gods distorted probability. Even chaos obeyed pattern. This did not. He stood alone in the dim light of the monitoring bay, cape still, jaw tight as he replayed the footage frame by frame. The man on the street moved like anyone else. No acceleration spikes. No micro-tells, no behavioral markers that suggested threat. And yet Batman's instincts screamed. "Run it again," he said. Oracle's voice crackled through the calm. "Bruce, there's nothing to run. Facial recognition can't place him. Databases don't disagree, they return null." Batman stared at the frozen image. "Null isn't nothing," he said. "It's a decision." Back on the street, he stopped in front of a convenience store, squinting at a faded sale sign taped crookedly to the window. "Huh," he muttered, "different prices." He stepped inside. Fluorescent lights buzzed. A bored cashier glanced up, then froze. He nodded politely, "Hi." The cashier swallowed, "Hi." He grabbed a drink, studied the label too long, then walked to the counter. As she rang it up, her hand shook just enough for the register to beep in error. She flushed, embarrassed, fingers fumbling. "Sorry," she said quickly. He smiled, awkward and genuine. "It's okay." Their fingers brushed as he took his change. For half a second the lights flickered, not off, not on, uncertain. Miles away, Something ancient shifted its attention. Not awakened, not alarmed. Interested. He stepped back outside, sunlight warming his face. The sky looked familiar but wrong in the way reflections sometimes are. He tilted his head, listening to the city's rhythm. This world was loud. Not with sound, but with intention. Every action pressed forward, driven by urgency, fear, ambition. Here, struggle wasn't a side effect of existence. It was the engine. He frowned. In the sky above, Superman finally moved. He descended slowly, deliberately visible, boots touching down on a rooftop overlooking the street. The concrete cracked softly beneath him, not from force but restraint. He scanned the area, eyes narrowing. There, the man stood below, looking up at a billboard advertising safety with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Superman inhaled and stepped forward, leaping down into the street with practiced ease. People gasped. Phones came up. The familiar comfort of a known hero rippled outward. The man looked over, surprised. "Oh," he said, "you're that guy." Superman smiled, the expression that had calmed wars and ended riots. "Hi," he said, "I know," the man replied, "from the posters." Superman blinked once. "Right." They stood a few feet apart, traffic halted around them, the city holding its breath. "I'm Superman," he said anyway. The man nodded. "I'm Clark." Superman stiffened. "That's my name." The man shrugged. "Common name." Silence stretched. "You're not from here," Superman said carefully. "No," Clark replied, "I don't think so." "Are you lost?" Clark looked around, at the buildings, the people, the quiet tension vibrating under everything. He thought of his own world, loud, violent, honest about its chaos. "Maybe," he said, "this place feels finished." Superman felt the pressure then, not outward, inward, like certainty collapsing under its own weight. "You shouldn't stay here," Superman said quietly. Clark met his gaze. For the first time since arriving, something flickered in his eyes, not fear, not defiance. Concern. "Why?" he asked. Superman opened his mouth and realized he didn't know the answer. Above them, unseen, the systems watching recalculated. Authority sharpened its focus. Narratives began to form, not yet spoken, but already shaping themselves around the anomaly standing calmly in the street. Batman's voice crackled in Superman's ear. "Clark," he said, "whatever he is, he's changing the math." Superman didn't look away. "I know," he replied. Because standing there, facing a man who did not push back against the world, he understood the danger wasn't power. It was what happened when power refused to participate in the struggle that defined everything else. And the universe was about to respond. Superman did not leave immediately. That, in hindsight, was the first mistake. He remained standing in the street long after traffic resumed, long after the crowd's curiosity dissolved into routine distraction. The man who called himself Clark had already walked on, unbothered by the way eyes followed him, by the way systems quietly reoriented to keep him centered without admitting they were doing so. Clark felt it as he flew upward again. Not a threat, a distortion, like gravity behaving politely around something it could not move. "This doesn't feel hostile," Superman said into the calm voice low. "It feels incompatible." Batman did not answer right away. He was watching live feeds from 5 angles, tracking the anomaly as it passed through the city without resistance. Cameras lost focus. Facial recognition stalled. Crowd density shifted around him like a slow current around stone. "Power always leaves fingerprints," Batman said finally. "This doesn't." "What does that mean?" Superman asked. "It means we can't frame him as a problem yet," Batman replied, "and that makes him dangerous." Clark landed again a few blocks away, this time on a rooftop watching Clark, the other Clark, sit on a park bench with a paper cup in his hands. Children ran past him. A dog barked. A man argued into a phone, voice sharp with desperation. Nothing happened. And yet something had happened. A woman on the bench beside him spoke suddenly, voice raw and unguarded. Superman couldn't hear the words, but he saw the reaction. Shoulders loosening, breath slowing. The kind of relief that came from saying something out loud without consequence. "That's not nothing," Superman murmured. "No," Batman agreed, "it's erosion." In the watchtower, Wonder Woman felt it then. A shift she recognized not from battlefields but from courts and councils. The balance had moved, not through force, but through presence. "This isn't an invasion," she said quietly. "It's a question." Flash scoffed nervously. "A question that breaks our sensors." Batman's eyes never left the screen. Questions are more dangerous than answers. Below, Clark stood from the bench, tossed his empty cup into a bin, and looked around as if expecting something to happen. Nothing did. His brow furrowed. "This place doesn't push back," he muttered. "That's not healthy." He walked again, slower now, letting the city press against him. He could feel its rules, their sharp edges dulled by habit and fear. This world needed friction. It needed struggle to justify its systems, its heroes, its hierarchies. And wherever he went, that friction softened. A minor argument died before becoming a fight. A would-be thief hesitated, then walked away embarrassed, unable to explain why the impulse suddenly felt stupid. A corporate meeting ended early because no one could quite remember what they were trying to dominate. Clark felt it all faintly, a tug behind the eyes, a pressure in the chest. "Am I doing this?" he wondered. High above, a different mind watched with interest sharpened into intent. Lex Luthor stood alone in a darkened office, hands clasped behind his back, city lights painting sharp angles across his face. He had watched gods rise and fall, monsters rampage, heroes posture. This was new. "He doesn't disrupt systems by force," Lex said softly. "He renders them optional." An aide shifted uneasily. "Sir, that doesn't sound." "Manageable," Lex finished. "No, it is." Lex turned back to the screen, watching Clark pause at a crosswalk, waiting patiently for the light to change. "A being that removes necessity," he continued, "is more dangerous than one who imposes it." Back on the street, Clark noticed something else. People were starting to look at him differently. Not with fear, not yet, with expectation. A man hesitated before asking for directions, then stopped himself. A woman opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, unsettled by the urge to say something honest to a stranger. Clark's shoulders tightened. "I don't want that," he whispered. Superman felt it too, the shift in emotional gravity, the way people unconsciously oriented toward the anomaly. He hovered closer now, uneasy. "You don't mean to," Superman said, landing beside him again. "But intent doesn't matter." Clark looked up. "In my world, everything mattered too much. Every punch, every fight, nothing ever ended." He gestured vaguely at the city. "Here, it feels like things might stop." Superman swallowed. This world runs on struggle. If it stops, something worse replaces it. Above them, unseen satellites realigned, not targeting Clark but tracking the patterns around him. Data flooded into secure servers. Analysts frowned. Models failed again. Batman's voice cut in. "They're noticing," he said. "Institutions don't tolerate irrelevance." Clark closed his eyes. "That's the problem," he said softly. "I didn't come here to matter." The air thickened. Not dramatically, deliberately. A pressure brushed against Clark's senses, not from the city but from beyond it. Something old, curious, measuring, not judging, yet. Clark's eyes snapped open. "That's not you," he said to Superman. Superman felt it too now, a tightening of reality that had nothing to do with Earth's rules. "No," he said grimly, "that's something else." For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. Then the pressure receded. Not gone. Waiting. Clark exhaled slowly, heart pounding. This place sends signals, he said. Loud ones. Superman nodded, and something answers. Sirens wailed in the distance, not for disaster but for protocol. Response units mobilized. Committees convened. Words like anomaly and containment passed from mouth to mouth. The math had changed. Batman leaned closer to his console, eyes narrowing. We're past observation, he said. The question now isn't what he is. Superman watched Clark disappear into the crowd, unremarkable and impossible all at once. It's what he's already started, Superman replied. Because somewhere beyond this universe's thin edge, attention had been drawn. And whatever had noticed was not patient forever. The first attempt to contain him did not involve force. That decision came from experience. This world had learned painfully that power pushed back when cornered. Gods resisted. Monsters retaliated. Even miracles turned violent when handled clumsily. So the response to Clark, quiet, unassuming Clark who moved through the city like a man late for nothing, was subtle. Observation first. Permissions tightened without announcement. Cameras lingered a second longer than they should have. Digital systems began flagging gaps rather than events, not what he did, but where certainty failed to follow him. Clark noticed none of it at first. He spent the afternoon walking. No destination, no urgency, just motion, steady and human. He listened to fragments of conversation bleed into one another, complaints, plans, regrets spoken too softly to matter, and everywhere he went the same thing followed. Hesitation. A construction foreman called a break early, unsure why the shouting had suddenly felt pointless. A pair of executives abandoned a heated argument and sat in silence, embarrassed by how thin their anger suddenly sounded. A teenager backed out of a fight with a stranger because the reason felt smaller once it had to be examined. Clark felt it accumulating now, like static beneath his skin. I don't like this, he muttered. High above, in rooms not meant for indecision, men and women leaned forward in their chairs. Stanford-grade analysts, metahuman behavior specialists, people who had built careers on turning chaos into leverage. They watched feeds slowed down and stripped of context, isolating the one variable that did not spike or collapse. He's not acting, one of them said carefully. That is the action, another replied. In the watchtower, Batman listened in silence as Wonder Woman spoke. This is what truth looks like without ritual, she said. People confronting themselves without distraction. Batman shook his head. No, this is what happens when friction disappears. People don't grow from that, they stagnate. Flash frowned, or maybe they calmed down. Batman turned to him. You don't calm entropy, you postpone it. Superman remained quiet, gaze fixed on the city below. He could feel the imbalance now more clearly than before. Not violent, directional, like a slope forming beneath the surface of everything. He's becoming a center, Clark said finally. Batman looked up, and centers attract control. That control arrived in the form of an invitation. Clark received it while standing on a pedestrian bridge, watching traffic inch forward with exhausted patience. The message appeared on a borrowed phone someone had handed him earlier out of reflex, then immediately regretted. A private meeting. A neutral location. A conversation. No threat, no demand. Just assumption. Clark read it twice, then looked up at the skyline. That's fast, he said. The building they chose was clean and deliberately unremarkable. Glass, steel, nothing that suggested secrecy or danger. The kind of place designed to feel temporary even while shaping permanent outcomes. Clark walked in without resistance. Security systems hesitated, then allowed him through, not because he overpowered them, but because their protocols could not classify refusal. Guards watched him pass, unease crawling under their professionalism. In a room with no windows, a man waited. He did not stand when Clark entered. He did not smile. His presence carried no need for approval. "You're difficult to categorize," the man said calmly. Clark tilted his head. "You're difficult to trust." The man accepted that without offense. "Fair." He gestured to a chair. Clark did not sit. "You've noticed the effect you're having," the man continued. Clark crossed his arms. "People feel lighter, quieter." "Yes," the man said, "and that concerns us." "Why?" Clark asked. "Isn't that better?" The man's gaze sharpened. "Because peace without choice is not peace, it's anesthesia." Clark frowned. "I'm not doing anything to them." "That's the issue," the man replied. "You remove the need to decide." Silence stretched. Outside the building, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the weight pressing into this room. Clark felt it again, the presence from before, distant but attentive, listening. "I didn't come here to change this world," Clark said quietly. "I just arrived." The man nodded. "Arrival is always an act." Clark exhaled slowly. "So what do you want?" "To understand you," the man replied, "and then to define you." Clark's jaw tightened. "People aren't definitions." "No," the man said, "but systems require them." High above, Batman watched the feed cut. "That's it," he said. "They're framing him." Superman clenched his fists. "If they push too hard." "They won't," Batman replied. "They don't need to. He's already changing the environment." Back in the room, Clark felt something settle into place. Not a trap, but a narrowing of options. The city's hum outside shifted pitch, subtle but unmistakable. "They're afraid," Clark said softly. The man didn't deny it. "Fear preserves order." Clark met his gaze. "It also kills growth." For the first time, the man hesitated. And in that hesitation, the unseen presence leaned closer. Not intervening. Recording. Clark felt it and understood too late that the choice he was avoiding was being deferred, but not erased. Because this world would not tolerate a center it did not control. And it was preparing to prove that. The room let him leave. That, more than anything else, confirmed Clark's unease. No guards blocked the door. No alarm sounded. The man at the table simply nodded once, as if the conversation had concluded exactly where it was meant to. Clark stepped back into the daylight with the uncomfortable certainty that he had not escaped anything. He had been released. The city greeted him with the same noise, the same movement, but something underneath had changed. The pressure was no longer passive. It had direction now. People were watching him. Not openly, not yet, but their attention lingered in the way eyes followed him a fraction too long before looking away, in the way conversations paused when he passed, then resumed with safer words. He felt it like a tightening around the edges of every moment. "They're measuring me," he muttered. Above him the sky looked unchanged. That was another lie. In the watchtower, Batman watched the city reorganize itself in real time, not through violence or decree, but through adjustment. Patrol routes shifted. Response times recalibrated. Legal frameworks activated clauses that had never been used because no one had ever fit the criteria they were written for. "They're building a box," Batman said quietly. "Not for his body, for his influence." Wonder Woman studied the data with a troubled expression. "You cannot cage what people feel." "No," Batman replied, "but you can teach them where they're allowed to feel it." Superman felt the consequence of that lesson almost immediately. A woman approached Clark on the street, hesitation written into every step. She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced the words out anyway. "Are you him?" she asked. Clark nodded cautiously. "I think so." Her shoulders sagged with a relief that startled him. "I was going to quit my job today," she said too quickly, as if afraid the courage would fade. I don't know why, it just felt right. Clark felt the weight of the moment settle between them. This was not a rescue. This was not a fight. This was a life leaning on a stranger for permission. "You don't need me for that," he said gently. She blinked, "But you made it easier." Clark shook his head. "No, you did." She smiled faintly, uncertain, then walked away. From across the street, a man watched the interaction, jaw tightening. He tapped something into his phone. The first narrative took shape that night. It didn't accuse, it didn't condemn, it contextualized. Panels of experts spoke calmly about psychological influence. Commentators framed Clark as a catalyst for instability, not because he caused harm, but because he disrupted norms. The language was careful, clinical, designed to feel responsible. Superman watched from the watchtower, fists clenched. "They're turning him into a variable people need to be protected from," he said. Batman nodded. "They don't need to prove he's dangerous. They just need to prove he's unnecessary." Below, Clark stood on the roof of his temporary apartment, listening to the city's hum. The presence returned then, closer than before, not pressing, not warning. "Waiting." "You see this too," Clark said quietly to the empty air. The presence did not answer, but he felt the shift of attention, the way a hand pauses just before touching something fragile. "I don't belong here," he whispered. And yet when he imagined leaving, the city felt wrong, like a wound stitched too tightly, ready to tear open the moment tension returned. In a secure office far from the noise, the man Clark had met earlier stood before a wall of projections. "We're past containment," he said calmly. "Now we manage perception." "What if he resists?" someone asked. "He won't," the man replied. "He doesn't want power." "Neither did the last ones," another voice muttered. The man's expression did not change. "Then we give him a choice he can't avoid." The next morning, Clark woke to sirens, not panicked, but coordinated. Outside, response units moved with practiced precision, sealing off a section of the city under the pretense of a routine operation. Clark stepped onto the street and felt it immediately. The box had closed. Not walls, expectations. Civilians watched from behind barriers, phones raised. A few recognized him. Some whispered, some frowned. No hatred yet, but the warmth was gone. Superman arrived moments later, landing beside him, eyes scanning the perimeter. "This is bad," he said under his breath. Clark nodded. "They're forcing a moment." A voice echoed over loudspeakers, calm and rehearsed. "For your safety and the safety of others, please remain where you are." Clark looked around at the faces staring back at him. Fear, curiosity, relief. "They want me to do something," he said. Superman met his gaze. "If you comply, you validate them. If you don't." "They escalate," Clark finished. The presence tightened then, no longer neutral. Not hostile, but attentive in a way that made Clark's skin prickle. The world itself seemed to lean in, as if this moment mattered more than any fight ever had. Clark took a slow breath. In his world, problems ended with punches. Here, every action echoed. "I didn't want to choose," he said softly. Superman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Some worlds don't let you avoid it." The loudspeakers crackled again. Clark stepped forward. Not in defiance, not in surrender. In decision. And as he did, the systems watching him recalculated, this time not to contain him but to respond. Because the anomaly had stopped drifting. And the world was about to discover what happened when something undefined chose a direction. The city did not erupt when Clark stepped forward. That was the mistake everyone made. They expected panic, resistance, spectacle, some visible reaction that could be pointed to and explained away. Instead, the moment stretched, thin and unbearable like a held breath that refused to resolve. The response units remained where they were. The crowd did not scatter. Cameras stayed fixed, waiting for permission to decide what they were witnessing. Clark stood within the invisible perimeter, feeling the weight of expectation press against his chest. "This is a stage," he said quietly. Superman nodded, eyes never leaving the crowd, "and they're waiting to see which role you choose." The loudspeakers fell silent. Somewhere behind reinforced glass, officials debated whether silence was safer than instruction. Every second without escalation deepened the tension, turning uncertainty into its own kind of force. Clark lifted his hand slowly, not in surrender, not in threat, just enough to show he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not a danger," he said, voice carrying farther than he intended. The words landed unevenly. Some people relaxed, others tensed. A few scoffed, discomfort curdling into suspicion. From a nearby balcony, a woman whispered, "That's what they all say." The presence returned then, heavier than before. Not above, not beyond, within the probability of the moment itself. Clark felt futures narrowing, collapsing inward around a handful of outcomes that no longer included neutrality. This was what the world did when it could not decide. It forced one. In the watchtower, Batman watched the feeds fracture into parallel interpretations. Some networks framed Clark as cooperative, others as evasive. The same footage cut and recut until intention blurred into suggestion. "They're not asking what he is anymore," Batman said. "They're deciding what he represents." Wonder Woman folded her arms. "Representation creates responsibility." "And blame," Batman replied. Below, the perimeter tightened, not visibly but socially. A man in the crowd shouted, demanding Clark explain himself. Another yelled back for him to leave. The murmur grew, not angry yet but restless. Clark felt it like static. "I'm not here to replace anything," he said, turning slowly, trying to meet as many eyes as possible. "I didn't come to lead, I didn't come to save." A laugh cut through the air, bitter, disbelieving. "Then why are you here?" someone shouted. Clark hesitated. The honest answer surfaced immediately and terrified him. "I don't know," he said. The reaction was immediate. Discomfort hardened into something sharper. Confusion demanded resolution. People did not like uncertainty spoken aloud, especially not from the center of it. Superman stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't owe them clarity." Clark shook his head. "They think I do." Above them, systems recalibrated again, not to contain but to frame. Analysts marked shifts in sentiment. Strategists adjusted language. The narrative tightened, threading fear carefully through words like influence and destabilization. In a secure room miles away, a familiar voice spoke calmly. "We move to Phase 3, Lex Luthor said. A subordinate hesitated. "He hasn't done anything." Lex smiled faintly. "Exactly." On the street, Clark felt the consequence arrive, not as force but as isolation. The crowd began to separate instinctively, a subtle widening of space around him. Not fear yet, caution. He had become a problem people could point at without numbing. "I think this is where it turns," Clark murmured. Superman nodded grimly. "This is where they decide what you're allowed to be." Sirens wailed again, this time not for protocol but for coverage. Media drones descended, lights blinking to life, angles chosen to suggest gravity. The story was being written in real time, and Clark could feel himself being edited. The presence leaned closer. "Not judging. Recording." Clark clenched his fists, then forced them to relax. He could end this in 1,000 ways. Step through the perimeter, lift into the sky, say the wrong word loudly enough to justify fear. Every option closed something else behind it. He took a breath. "I'm staying," he said, quietly but firmly, "but I won't be what you're trying to make me." The words rippled outward, colliding with expectation. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman stepped forward despite the pressure, voice shaking. "Then what are you?" Clark met her gaze. A mistake, he said, and maybe a warning. The air tightened. Superman felt it immediately, the unseen presence shifting, attention sharpening. This was no longer observation. This was alignment. Batman's voice cut in tense. Clark, whatever you're about to do, this world will remember it. Clark nodded once. I know, he said, because the moment had passed where nothing could be done. Now every choice would leave a mark. And the universe was leaning in to see which one he would make. The crowd did not disperse after Clark spoke. That was the second mistake. People expected resolution, authority stepping in, a command issued, something definitive enough to relieve them of responsibility. Instead, they were left holding the weight of his words themselves. A mistake, a warning, neither accusation nor comfort, just uncertainty sharpened into presence. That kind of silence demanded interpretation. Someone began clapping, one person, then another. It wasn't approval, it wasn't mockery, it was nerves seeking release. The sound spread unevenly, then collapsed into awkward quiet as quickly as it had begun. Clark felt the pressure spike. Superman's posture shifted instinctively, ready to intervene, but he didn't move. He could feel it too, the way the moment had slipped out of control, not because of chaos, but because of choice. Too many people deciding for themselves at once. High above, the drones adjusted angles, reframing the scene. Clark no longer stood at the center of a question. He was becoming the center of a debate. And debates required sides. A man pushed forward, voice loud with rehearsed certainty. You don't get to just show up and decide things, he shouted. We didn't ask for you. Clark met his eyes. Neither did I. The man faltered, thrown off by the lack of defiance. That hesitation rippled outward, infecting the crowd with discomfort. From the perimeter, officials exchanged glances. This was not how control was supposed to reassert itself. Pull back, a voice said over comms. Let it breathe. The instruction came too late. In a nearby command center, Lex Luthor watched the feed with measured patience. He did not need panic. He needed drift. Let them argue, he said calmly. Conflict will find its own structure. Clark felt something shift then, not in the crowd but in the world itself. The presence that had been watching now pressed closer, not heavier but more precise. Possibilities narrowed, futures aligned around a smaller set of outcomes. This was the cost of attention. Superman's voice dropped. They're waiting for escalation. Clark nodded. I won't give it to them. But if you don't, Superman replied, someone else will. As if summoned by the thought, a scuffle broke out at the edge of the crowd. Raised voices, a shove, nothing serious, but enough. Cameras snapped toward it instantly, hungry. Clark turned sharply. No, he said. The word carried more weight than it should have. The scuffle stopped, not because the people involved had been commanded, but because the momentum had vanished, like trying to argue after realizing you'd forgotten what you were angry about. That was when fear truly arrived. People felt it immediately, not of Clark's power but of the implication. Control had slipped, not violently but quietly. That was worse. He did that, someone whispered. No, another replied. He didn't do anything. The contradiction gnawed at them. In the watchtower, Batman's jaw tightened. They're going to interpret restraint as manipulation. Wonder Woman closed her eyes briefly, because restraint threatens authority. Clark felt it now, how thin the line had become. Every non-action looked like intent. Every pause felt like strategy. He was being blamed not for what he did, but for what no longer happened around him. I'm changing them, he said softly. Superman shook his head. You're revealing them. That distinction did not matter to the crowd. Orders came down, subtle but decisive. The perimeter widened. Armed units moved, not aggressively but visibly, enough to remind everyone where power was supposed to reside. Clark felt the box tightening again. Not walls. Narrative. A voice boomed from a speaker. For public safety, this area is now restricted. The crowd reacted instantly. Relief washed through many faces. Authority had returned. Someone else would decide. Clark closed his eyes. This is how it happens, he said. They give up choice because it's heavy. Superman said nothing. The presence shifted again, not satisfied, not disappointed, simply nodding the transition. The world had chosen containment over uncertainty. Clark opened his eyes and stepped backward. Not away. Into the perimeter. Gasps rippled outward. Officials stiffened. Systems recalibrated, alarms flirting with thresholds they were not meant to cross. Superman's voice snapped tight. Clark. I know, Clark said quietly. If I keep standing here, they'll use me as a reason forever. He took another step. The pressure mounted, not pain, resistance, the idea of him strained against definitions closing in. In a secure office, Lex Luthor leaned forward for the first time. Hold, he said softly. Let's see which way he breaks. Clark felt the presence focus fully now, no longer observing the crowd, but him. The weight of consequence pressed in from every angle. He could push through. He could leave. Or he stopped, turned, and sat down. Right there on the asphalt. The effect was immediate. Systems stuttered. The narrative faltered. Analysts froze, unsure how to frame a man who neither advanced nor retreated. The crowd fell into stunned silence. I'm not fighting you, Clark said, voice calm, carrying easily. And I'm not fixing this. Murmurs spread. I'm staying, he continued, but I won't remove the weight of your choices anymore. Superman felt the world tilt. The presence hesitated. For the first time since Clark's arrival, something older than authority recalculated. Because the anomaly had chosen not to escape. Not to dominate, but to remain. And let the world feel what it was trying to avoid. The silence stretched, fragile and dangerous. And somewhere deep within the systems designed to preserve control, a final option unlocked, one that did not care about patience. Only resolution. The city did not explode after Clark sat down. That was the third mistake. Everyone had been bracing for violence, for some visible rupture that could justify fear and confirm expectation. Instead, the moment settled into something far more corrosive, uncertainty with no outlet. The containment perimeter held. The armed units stayed where they were. The crowd didn't surge or flee. They waited. Waiting had never been part of the design. Clark sat cross-legged on the asphalt, hands resting loosely on his knees, breathing steady. He felt the pressure around him reorganize, not loosening, not tightening, but rethinking. Systems struggled most when faced with something that refused to escalate. Superman hovered just outside the perimeter, unable to intervene without validating the very structure Clark was resisting. He'd faced gods, tyrants, monsters that could shatter continents, but this was different. This was a crisis of meaning. He's breaking the script, Superman said quietly. Batman's reply came instantly, which means they'll rewrite it. Across the city, small fractures began to appear. Response units hesitated when new calls came in, unsure whether to redeploy or hold position. Command chains looped back on themselves. Protocols contradicted one another in ways no simulation had prepared for. Nothing failed outright, but nothing moved cleanly either. In a downtown precinct, an officer lowered his weapon slowly, eyes fixed on a screen replaying Clark sitting calmly under a ring of force. "What are we doing?" he whispered. No one answered. In a sealed room far beneath the city, Lex Luthor watched with something like fascination. "He's refusing resolution," Lex murmured. "That's unacceptable." An age shifted uneasily. Public sentiment is unstable. Some see him as peaceful, others as manipulative. Lex nodded. Of course they do. He's denying them clarity. And what do we do? Lex smiled thinly. We restore it. Orders moved quietly through layers of infrastructure, not to arrest Clark, not to attack him, to redefine the environment. Outside the perimeter, screens across the city flickered to life. Emergency broadcasts interrupted programming, not with panic but reassurance. Calm voices explained the situation in careful language. An anomalous individual, temporary containment, necessary measures to ensure stability. Clark felt the shift immediately. Not pressure. Distance. People watching him now weren't just uncertain. They were being told how to feel. Relief crept in, replacing discomfort. The burden of choice slid away, welcomed eagerly. Superman clenched his fists. They're turning him into a problem they can manage. Batman's voice was grim. No, they're turning him into a reason. On the ground, Clark opened his eyes and looked around. Faces stared back from behind barriers and screens. Some curious, some afraid, many grateful that someone else had taken responsibility away from them again. This is worse, Clark said softly. The presence stirred, not above, not beyond, but threaded through the moment itself. It wasn't reacting to authority or defiance. It was watching alignment. This was how worlds decided who they were. A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward despite the tension. Her hands shook, but her voice held. "You said you'd stay," she called out. "What does that mean now?" Clark met her gaze. "It means I won't be your excuse," he said, "and I won't be your solution." Murmurs rippled outward, uneasy. "That's not fair," someone shouted. Clark nodded. "No, it is." The response unit stiffened. Orders crackled through comms, subtle shifts in posture, tightening formations. Not aggression, readiness. Superman felt the escalation forming like a storm that hadn't decided how to break. They're running out of patience. Clark stood slowly. The crowd tensed as one. He raised his hands, not to surrender but to steady the moment. "If you keep going like this," he said, voice firm but calm, "you'll build something that doesn't need you anymore, something that decides for you." Silence followed. Then a voice, amplified and official, cut through the air. "Step back inside the containment zone." Clark looked toward the source of the command. The choice had narrowed. Not fight or flee. Stay passive or act. The presence leaned in, closer than ever, no longer neutral. Waiting to see whether this world would choose comfort over consequence. Clark took a breath. And for the first time since arriving, he felt something like anger. Not at the people, not at the systems, but at the lie beneath it all. That control could replace responsibility. He lowered his hands. The containment field hummed louder. Somewhere deep within the architecture of power, the final contingency armed itself, not as a weapon, but as a decision engine. And the city, unaware of how close it stood to redefining itself, waited to see whether Clark would finally push back, or let the world complete its retreat from choice. The containment field did not collapse when Clark stepped forward. It adjusted. That was the moment Superman understood how dangerous this had become. The air thickened, not with force but with insistence. The field wasn't trying to stop Clark's body, it was narrowing the range of what was allowed to happen. Movement still existed. Speech still existed. But intention began to feel heavy, like walking through water that resisted thought more than motion. Clark felt it immediately. This wasn't restraint designed for strength. It was restraint designed for meaning. Around the perimeter, response units shifted formation, not closer, not farther, angled. Every movement was deliberate, rehearsed. The kind of choreography that came from months of planning, not panic. Someone had anticipated this moment, anticipated a being who wouldn't attack, who wouldn't flee, who wouldn't comply cleanly. "Clark," Superman said, his voice low, urgent. "They're not containing you, they're contextualizing you." Clark didn't look away from the crowd. "I know." On the screen, still glowing above the streets, the narrative refined itself. Words like cooperation and public safety repeated with soothing regularity. Experts appeared. Analysts. Authority figures who smiled too easily while explaining why this moment required trust in systems rather than individuals. Lex Luthor watched the metrics climb. Approval, relief, stability. "This is how you win without resistance," he said quietly. "You make resistance feel irresponsible." An aide leaned closer. "He's still not complying." Lex's smile thinned. "He doesn't need to, the crowd will do it for him." And they began to. A man near the back shouted, "Just do what they're asking." Another voice followed, "Why make this harder than it needs to be?" Clark turned slowly, taking them in. Ordinary people, tired people, people who had spent their lives surviving systems they didn't trust but relied on anyway. "I'm not making it harder," Clark said. "I'm making it honest." That was when the first stone hit the field. It didn't come from anger, it came from fear. The stone bounced harmlessly off the invisible barrier, clattering to the ground. But the sound echoed far louder than its weight justified. Superman felt something break, not in the field but in the crowd. "That's it," Batman said from the watchtower, his voice tight. "They're crossing the threshold." The response units didn't move yet. They didn't need to. The system was working as intended. Conflict was externalizing itself, redirected away from authority and toward the anomaly that had disrupted equilibrium. Clark closed his eyes for a brief moment. He felt the presence again, closer now, threaded through every probability collapsing into this one outcome. It wasn't judging him. It was measuring impact. When Clark opened his eyes, the city felt smaller. "Listen to me," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "If you turn this into fear, it won't stop here. You'll build something that watches you forever because you asked it to." Some listened. Most didn't. Superman moved instinctively, drifting closer to the perimeter, ready to intervene if the field surged. "Clark, if you push now." "I know," Clark replied softly. "If I push, I prove them right." Another object struck the field, then another. "Not a barrage." "Testing." Lex exhaled, satisfied. "There it is, self-correction." High above, the greater presence shifted, not approving, not condemning, simply recalibrating. Worlds weren't judged by intentions. They were judged by trajectories. Clark took a step back. Not in retreat. In recognition. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, sensing momentum. He raised his hands again, not in surrender but in pause. "I won't fight you," Clark said, voice steady despite the pressure compressing thought itself. "And I won't let you turn me into a permission slip for something you won't be able to dismantle later." The containment field flickered. Just once. Every sensor spiked. Batman's screens lit up red, not alerts but thresholds breached. "That's it," he said. "They've armed the decision engine." Superman felt it too, a conceptual shift, not an attack. A system designed to decide what Clark was allowed to be, regardless of what he chose. "Clark," Superman said urgently, "they're about to lock this." Clark looked at him then, really looked. There was no fear in his eyes. Only resolve. "Then this is where I stop being quiet," Clark said. He didn't strike the field. He stepped through the moment. Not with force, but with refusal. The containment field screamed, not audibly but mathematically. Probability fractured. The decision engine hesitated, unable to categorize an action that wasn't opposition or compliance. For a heartbeat, the city held its breath. And in that suspended instant, the presence leaned in fully. No longer observing a variable. but preparing to mark a consequence that would outlive Clark's choice. The moment did not explode. It settled. That was the first sign this was different from every crisis Superman had ever faced. The containment field did not shatter. It didn't recoil in failure or surge in retaliation. Instead, it recalibrated downward, like a machine realizing it had reached the edge of its authority and choosing not to acknowledge it. The air lightened. Pressure receded. The crowd's forward lean softened into uncertainty. People blinked. Not because they had been dazzled. Because something inside them had quietly failed to arrive. No crackdown. No decisive act. No clean ending. Clark hovered just above the ground, cape unmoving, hands still open. He had stepped through the moment not by breaking it, but by denying it the reaction it was built to extract. Batman exhaled slowly in the watchtower, hands resting flat on the console. "That's it," he said. The system blinked. Wonder Woman turned toward him. "Is that good?" Bruce didn't answer right away. His screens were alive with cascading data, models collapsing, contingencies invalidating themselves, projections returning error states they had never been coded to express. "It's unstable," he finally said. "Not broken, exposed." On the ground, response units hesitated. Orders failed to propagate cleanly. Some commanders lowered weapons. Others waited for confirmation that never came. The narrative lattice Lex had built was still standing, but it no longer knew where to apply pressure. Lex Luthor felt it immediately. Not panic. Disruption. The metrics dipped not catastrophically but perceptibly. Approval fractured along unfamiliar lines. Commentary turned cautious. Analysts hedged. Confidence lost its sharpness. "Containment," an aide asked quietly. Lex stared at the display showing Clark hovering calmly, where a god was supposed to either kneel or burn. "No," Lex said. "Containment implies dominance. This requires reframing." Outside, Clark descended fully, boots touching pavement. The crowd did not cheer. They didn't boo either. They watched. And in that watching, something ancient and deeply human reasserted itself. Uncertainty without instruction. A woman near the front spoke, voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "So, what now?" Clark looked at her, really looked, saw exhaustion, not defiance, fear mixed with a hope she hadn't meant to feel. "That," he said gently, "is up to you." No slogan followed. No promise. The silence that came next was uneven, uncomfortable, real. People began to drift away, not as a unit but individually. Conversations resumed in low tones. Arguments broke out, then softened. No authority told them to leave. No system cleared the space. They chose. Superman watched from a distance, heart heavy and strangely proud. Clark hadn't saved the day in any way the world could measure, but he had broken a loop that would have consumed it slowly. Still, Superman felt the presence again. Not looming. Patient. That was what terrified him. Because patience implied continuation. Clark felt it too as he walked away from the dispersing crowd, not pursued, not celebrated. Just another figure moving through a city that no longer knew what he represented. The pressure followed him, not as threat but as accounting. Every choice left residue. High above, something vast finished recording a data set it had never needed before. Not strength. Not victory. But refusal. In the days that followed, the city did not return to normal. It adjusted badly. Institutions moved faster, clumsier, trying to reassert certainty where none had been restored. New policies emerged half-formed. Oversight committees argued themselves into paralysis. The narrative fractured into competing explanations that canceled each other out. People noticed. Crime didn't spike, but neither did trust. Hero interventions were questioned openly, not angrily, Clinically, every action weighed against unseen systems whose authority no longer felt absolute. Superman felt eyes on him constantly now, not reverent, not hostile. Evaluative. Batman called him to the watchtower on the third night. Clark arrived quietly, landing in the observation bay where Earth turned slowly beneath reinforced glass. Bruce didn't greet him. "Lex is backing off," Batman said instead. "That means he's planning something longer." Clark folded his arms. "You think this is over?" "No," Bruce replied. "I think it's begun transitioning." "To what?" Bruce turned. His eyes looked older than Clark remembered. "To a world that knows gods can hesitate." Clark absorbed that in silence. "That scares people," Bruce continued, "and it empowers them, sometimes in the worst ways." Clark looked down at Earth. "I didn't want to make it about me." "You didn't," Bruce said. "You made it about choice, and that's harder to control than fear." The presence stirred again, closer now, brushing the edge of Clark's awareness not as warning, but as inevitability. Batman felt it too. His systems didn't register it, but his instincts, sharpened by decades of watching patterns collapse, screamed. "You feel that?" Bruce asked. Clark nodded. "It's deciding whether this universe learned anything." Bruce's jaw tightened. "And if it did?" Clark didn't answer. Because somewhere far beyond Earth's orbit, beyond even the Watcher's quiet vigilance, the ledger of consequence was opening, not to punish, but to balance. Not with fire, with necessity. That night the sky above the city dimmed, not darkened but thinned. Stars seemed sharper, closer, as if the universe itself were leaning in to inspect its work. People felt it without understanding. A wrongness that wasn't danger yet. Superman stood on a rooftop alone, cape trailing, listening to the city breathe. "If you're going to act," he said softly to the empty sky, "do it with restraint." The presence did not answer. But the silence carried weight. Because whatever came next would not be a test of power. It would be a test of whether a world that had seen a god refuse domination could survive the consequences of that refusal. And somewhere, far beyond the visible spectrum, the first irreversible variable locked into place. The change did not arrive as disaster. It arrived as necessity. That was the cruel elegance of it, the way the universe corrected itself not through punishment, but through demand. The thinning sky over the city did not crack open. No celestial force descended. No judgment was announced. Instead, pressures that had long been deferred began to surface all at once, as if the world had decided it could no longer afford ambiguity. Superman felt it in the smallest things first. A rescue went wrong not because he failed, but because people waited too long before calling for help, unsure whether intervention was still something they were allowed to expect. A conflict escalated because no authority stepped in early enough. Each side convinced hesitation was now the responsible choice. The city wasn't collapsing. It was recalibrating painfully. Clark walked its streets at night, unrecognized more often now, his presence no longer framed by certainty. He listened. He watched. He resisted the instinct to fix. This was the price of refusal. In the watchtower, Batman dismantled systems he had spent years perfecting. Not out of guilt, but recognition. Models built on inevitability no longer worked in a world where hesitation had become visible. "We optimized for control," Bruce said quietly to Diana. "We never optimized for consequence." Wonder Woman nodded, "Because consequence is human." Lex Luthor adapted faster than anyone else. That was his talent. He did not attempt another containment. He did not escalate openly. Instead, he pivoted toward influence without architecture. Subtle incentives, cultural shaping, quiet encouragement of dependence disguised as choice. He didn't need Superman gone. He needed the lesson softened. But the lesson had already taken root. People argued more now about responsibility, about expectation, about whether safety had ever truly belonged to someone else. The debates were messy, unresolved, exhausting. They were real. Clark felt the presence one final time as he stood at the edge of the city before dawn, the horizon pale and uncertain. It no longer pressed. It no longer evaluated. It waited. Not for him. For the world. "I didn't fix anything," Clark said softly. The presence did not disagree. "I didn't break it either," he continued. Still no answer. Clark exhaled, understanding settling into his bones. This had never been about resolution, only transition. The universe did not correct outcomes, it balanced trajectories. And his role in that balance was ending. Superman returned to the watchtower once more, not as a guardian overseeing Earth, but as a man acknowledging a boundary. Bruce met him at the viewport. "You're leaving," Batman said. Clark nodded. "Not because I'm done, because staying would become control again." Bruce studied him for a long moment. "They'll mythologize this," he said. "They always do." "Let them," Clark replied, "as long as they don't outsource themselves to it." Clark stepped back from the glass, sunlight catching the edge of the earth below. "The next time they look up," he said, "it should be because they chose to, not because they're waiting." And then he was gone. Not vanished. Withdrawn. The world felt it immediately, not as loss but as exposure. The safety net thinned, choices weighed more, consequences arrived faster. Some people failed. Some adapted. Institutions hardened, others cracked. Heroes became more careful, more human. Lex Luthor continued, of course. Power always survived, but it moved differently now, forced to negotiate with a public that had seen what hesitation revealed. And far beyond Earth, the ledger closed. Not with satisfaction. With neutrality. The universe did not reward the world. It did not condemn it. It simply recorded that once. Just once. A god had refused to rule. And that refusal had changed the shape of everything that followed. The city woke to another morning, louder than before, messier, alive in ways that could not be optimized. And somewhere in that noise, humanity began the slow, uneven work of deciding what it would become without certainty as a shield. That choice, uncomfortable, irreversible, was the only ending this story was ever going to allow.